In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers, readers, participants. It's the Sublation Magazine show. Again, I'm Douglas Lain, author of many books, including, let's see, which one am I going to pull to the Wave of Mutilation. It's a novella. You should go find it. I'm also the guy who runs his channel and does a lot of the editing and so forth for Sublation. With me is Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
It's great to be here. I have a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. I've written 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, out with Edinburgh University Press this past November.
Great. So this time we're going to be talking about Trump's executive orders and specifically about his attempts to impose tariffs on, it looks like at this point, every nation in the world that isn't America. I'm having a hard time keeping track of just how many tariffs have flown out the door. But I have some general comments about the reaction to his executive orders. Specifically, I mean, he's issued 44 executive orders and many memorandums since he's taken office. He's only been in office for, I think, 2 weeks now. Since the orders were issued, all the different orders have been issued, there's been what appears to me to be some deliberate misinterpretations of the orders by state bureaucrats. The big example would be in response to a memo freezing funding within the administrative state, which included an exemption for any program that provides direct benefits to individuals and that gave us examples of programs that were not affected, Social Security, Medicare. But despite what I thought was fairly clear exemptions of the programs in the freeze, many people within the bureaucracy appeared to be confused. And along the way, many journalists assisted their confusion and created kind of a small panic around whether people would be getting their Social Security checks, whether people would be able to use Medicare or Medicaid in the months to come, which, required, after that happened, it required the Trump administration to rescind the memo and kind of try to start again. To me, it seems as though what we're witnessing is Trump attacking the state bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, trying to bring it to heel, and they are resisting. Another example would be his order trying to end DEI programs. And this was characterized by Democrats as an attempt to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement altogether. Federal bureaucrats again began to intentionally misunderstand the order. The Air Force removed training videos about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Women's Air Force service pilots, as an example. The Defense Intelligence Agency canceled Black History Month until they were instructed to resume showing these videos and reinstate Black History Month. But a few of the executive orders have not been misinterpreted. Trump's tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China are difficult to misconstrue. And also the executive orders going after immigrants and foreign nationals have not been misinterpreted. I'd like to talk about those in particular if we have time. But you've recently written about the tariffs, and I wanted to get your impressions or to pick your brain about what you think these tariffs are aiming at, what the likely outcome will be, and how you think left socialists should respond, or at least try to understand what's happening. So what's your view on Canada, Mexico, and Trump?
Yeah, these tariffs, these are not the first term tariffs. The first term tariffs tended to go after specific sectors, often for the purposes of trying to encourage reshoring of particular industries to the United States. They were focused. They often targeted things that were relevant to defense, like steel production. These tariffs are broad spectrum tariffs. And they're tariffs with states, in the case of Canada and Mexico, that Trump concluded a trade agreement with. It's his own trade agreement that he's violating with these tariffs. The agreement that he agreed to replace NAFTA. One of the things that he promised to do was to kill NAFTA. So he replaced NAFTA with another agreement that was pretty similar to NAFTA. It included some minor concessions by Canada and Mexico, but not nearly as big or as major as he played them up to be. Since they agreed to his trade agreement, it's strange that he is now tariffing them, and tariffing them in this very broad spectrum, extremely punitive way. Why do you do these kinds of broad spectrum tariffs? It's not about trying to strategically encourage particular industries to come back to the United States to strengthen our military capability. This is a different kind of game that's now being played. So in the case of the tariffs on China, I think that's relatively straightforward. We're talking about a 10% tariff across the board on Chinese exports, on top of the tariffs that already exist that are in some cases considerably higher, 50%, 100% on specific industries that are considered vital national interest security industries, right? Now it's going to be 10% across the board. I think this is an attempt to accelerate the decoupling, which has not gone as quickly as I think some in the United States would like it to go. There's an attempt to decouple the US and Chinese economies to encourage businesses to move from China to, if not the United States, then friendly states like Vietnam or the Philippines or India, and to create friendships with more states in Asia by encouraging businesses to move to these places. So if you become friendly with the United States, you will benefit from this exodus of business from China to these other places. So far, it hasn't been that effective at getting companies to leave China. The goods imports from China to the United States are still very close to what they were before Trump even came into office. But it has been effective, I think, at preventing further growth in the export market between China and the United States. And it has certainly led to a significant amount of growth in other states like Vietnam or India. This tariff just pushes that faster. It's an attempt to do that quicker and harder. Similarly, the tariff on Mexico, I think, is very much aimed, as the administration has described, about immigration and about fentanyl. And I think that the aim there is also not just to control the southern border, but to get Mexico to commit more resources to controlling the Latin American border, the border it has with Guatemala and Belize. This is a border that is often used to traffic people from countries further south. And the Trump administration tends to think about the criminal population not merely as a Mexican-American thing, or even not primarily as a Mexican-American thing, but as Latin American and South American migrants coming up through Mexico, coming all the way from the Southern Hemisphere in some cases, and then making their way into the United States. So Mexico is criticized not just for not controlling the southern border, but for having a lax attitude toward its own southern border. And that's, I think, going to be one of the major factors here. Canada, however, is weird. The thing with Canada is very strange, and I think it's very different. And I do think that we have to take seriously what's going on with Canada. So, yeah, there's some level of immigration complaint that can be made with regard to Canada. There has been an uptick in border crossings on the northern border relative to what there used to be. But I don't think that's the principal reason that Canada is getting tariffed at this rate. This is very heavy to use on an allied state that's in NATO. It's one thing to play hardball in Latin America. Lots of U.S. presidents do that. Lots of U.S. presidents kick around the Latin American countries. But to do this to Canada is very, very significant. Is it about defense spending? Because Canada is one of the most flagrant underspenders in NATO. Canada spends less than nearly every other NATO member state, despite all of the things that Trump has said about this and how much he cares about this. Canada has continuously ignored him with regard to that. Is he after a defense spending increase from Canada? Is he very serious about the stuff he says about trying to annex it or get it to join the United States? Or is he using that as a leverage play to extract defense concessions? I think he's after more than just border changes with Canada. I also think that there may be personal animus. I think that Justin Trudeau has, at many points, flagrantly disrespected Donald Trump in a way that is just not mature statesmanship. It's just not responsible behavior to talk to a head of state of a country that is powerful, talk about that person in public in the way that Justin Trudeau has tended to talk about Donald Trump. And I think for this reason, Donald Trump has, to some degree, a desire to see Justin Trudeau out of Canadian politics and badly humiliated. And this is something that has already been achieved even by discussing the possibility of tariffs, because the deputy prime minister and the finance minister, who are the same person, she resigned from Trudeau's cabinet in response to just the discussion of this as a possibility, because in her view, Trudeau had no credible plan to handle the effects of the tariffs. He was going to do spending that was, in her view, too early, because the amount that Canada can spend to purchase some of the goods that would otherwise not be purchased by the United States, to cushion the blow with aid to adversely affected economic sectors. It's not a whole lot of powder, because the whole Canadian GDP is $2 trillion, and the exports to the United States are $400 billion. So it's an incredibly difficult fiscal problem. Also, the Canadian federal government doesn't have the fiscal capacity of the American federal government relative to the provinces. It's much weaker in terms of its tax base. So there's just no mechanism by which the Canadian federal government can deal with any kind of prolonged period in which American tariffs are at this kind of rate. People talk about, could he cut a deal with China? China doesn't buy in the kind of quantities the things that Canada makes. The things that Canada makes are entirely designed around what the neighbor to the south buys, because they've had this incredibly close trading relationship for an enormously long time. The economics of it is you can stick it on a truck, drive it a few hundred miles south, and take it to market. This is not stuff that's going to go all the way to Vancouver and go on a container ship. It's madness. The way people talk about trade, they have no concept of how it actually works. So this is, I think, a huge existential crisis for Canada, this tariff. The Liberal Party seems absolutely at sea about what to do about it. They're having a leadership contest to replace Trudeau, who was compelled to resign, because not only did his own party think that he didn't have a credible plan, the NDP, the New Democratic Party, which was previously supporting his minority government, they threatened to force an early election if he didn't quit. So there's a total crisis of confidence in the leadership. Now we're waiting for a new prime minister to be picked on March 9th. The Liberal Party will replace Trudeau. And then the real kicker is that Canada has a general election that's scheduled by their fixed term parliaments rule that they implemented in October. So in October, there's going to be a potential change of leadership again. And indeed, the polls in Canada indicate that the Conservative Party is very, very likely to win that election, which means that whoever comes in, the Liberal person who comes in after this leadership contest is going to be this lame duck leader who can say, we're going to hang tough and try to fight back against these tariffs. But they're doing it up against this deadline. And the Conservative, he's now talking like, oh, of course, I will continue to resist the tariffs. And when I get in, I'll continue to reciprocal tariff. But this is a guy who has a long history of pro-American statements, expressing support for the United States. So his level of credibility to back up the Liberal government in its tariff strategy is not very high. So we're going to get into a situation where Trump is in all likelihood going to wait until after that general election before he would even consider backing off on the tariff, because why should he not wait until he gets potentially a more favorable negotiating partner? And that means an incredibly long period of time in which the tariffs will be in effect with no one able to credibly negotiate. So it's going to be an extraordinarily economically painful period, I think, for Canada. And meanwhile, the reason that the Republican senators are allowing this, they have the power. The senators could vote to take away the emergency tariffing power. It's a delegated power that belongs to the president specifically because Congress assigned it to him. So Congress can take it back at any point. And in the past, when Trump talked about the tariffs, one of the mechanisms that was used to moderate them was that Congress would threaten to revoke the tariffing power if it went too far. And there are always some Republican senators who every time the tariffs come out, they go, we don't like this. This isn't what we're about. The people like Rand Paul will come out and go, we're for free trade. This is bad. Or we used to be for free trade. We should be for it again. But the reaction this time is pretty muted. And I think it's in large part because the export sectors that deal with Canada are largely agricultural in character. And the Trump administration demonstrated in 2019 that it was willing to pay off these farmers to sustain them during a period in which there's a tariff war. So if the farmers are not going to be adversely affected because the government is just going to deficit spend to keep them in good shape, you think about how much, the retaliatory tariffs that Trudeau announced, they were only on 155 billion of the US exports. So they were already not on everything that the United States exports to Canada, which is already a sign of weakness, that they can't tariff all of it. They need some of it and can't tariff all of it. But 155 billion, it's much easier for the United States to, in various ways, kick that along for a year than for the Canadians to do that to the industries affected by the American tariff. And that some of the stuff that Canadian politicians are saying about how they're going to deal, Canadians can buy it instead. This is delusional stuff. The Canadian market cannot absorb 400 billion, even 100 or 200 billion in consumption that the Americans don't do. And if you were to unleash all of these products on the Canadian consumer market, you'd have a glut, you'd have deflationary effects, you'd have recession on the basis of this. It doesn't make sense.
I want to throw this comment back up on the screen that flashed by before. Sam Badger says, America declaring a trade war with all our partners when we're a net importer is a dumb move. And then there was another comment from Sam about, something about going from Trump saying I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and everyone would still love me to Trump. Here we go. Trump went from I can shoot a guy on Fifth Avenue and people will still love me to I can shoot the whole damn U.S. economy and people will still love me. Now, everything you just said indicates to me that in this trade war with Canada, Trump is not risking the U.S. economy in the same way that the Canadians would be in engaging in the war. That the advantage is Trump and the U.S. here, right? I mean, clearly.
Well, so, Sam's point, in principle, if the United States starts trade wars with a very, very large number of states in a very short period of time, then you would, in principle, get to a stage at which it would produce major shortages of things as you had to rewrite the supply chains. The question is, can Donald Trump start multiple trade wars at once with multiple distinct different states while continuing to trade with other states? And by continuing to trade with other states, cushion to a large degree the effects of this, because it's not the case that every time the United States tariffs one of these countries, that industry has to be reshored to the United States.
Right.
What will generally happen instead is that the United States will import more from other favored states. And so the tariffs become a way not just to punish a state that you don't like or that you're mad at, but to reward other allied states, which then, in relative terms, are getting favorable treatment. And this is why I say a tariff on China is good for the relationship with Vietnam. It's good for the relationship with India. So it strengthens American ties to the countries that aren't being tariffed. And in this way, it's not at all the case that when Trump announces tariffs on several states, this just means that we're in a trade war with the whole planet. there are many states that stand to benefit from these tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Many states, not just the
Right.
United States.
Yeah.
So
Okay. And
this complicates it.
yeah, no, I hear you completely. So it did strike me when just come staying with Canada for a minute that the tariffs on Canada, the official reasons given, with one was to get fentanyl to stop flowing across the Canadian border, and there is some of that coming across the Canadian border. But and also if you're going to try to stop the flow in Mexico from Mexico, you got to secure the northern border as well because they will find it. The people who are bringing it in will find the weak points and go in. So you want to secure both borders. That makes sense, but it isn't the primary reason this is happening. And the trade deficit with Canada, it isn't existential for the United States, right? It isn't that a huge concern, but
and these are his own terms. He agreed to this trade deal in his first term. They signed it. They made the concessions he asked for.
Right. But Trudeau has aligned himself, and Canada has aligned itself with the outgoing administration and with a variety of what I'll call, like, I guess, NATO projects of the kind of the old world order that Trump is attempting to rearrange. So it does seem to me to make political sense if you want to find new allies or, and to build a different arrangement on the world stage to punish the allies of your enemies domestically. And I think Trudeau has done a lot of things to indicate that he is allied with Trump's enemies domestically. This is maybe connected to the way in which Trump is trying to clean house within the U.S. bureaucracy. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that both the Republicans and the Democrats at this point position various foreign states and foreign heads of state as friendly to their opponents. And they are seeing lines of foreign interference in American politics coming from lots of different places. So just as the Democrats framed Trump as in league in some way with Putin or with Russia, there will be a corresponding tendency to frame the Democrats as in league in various ways with some of the NATO allies that did not like the demand to pay the 2%. Many people in the NATO allied states, spoke very openly about potentially responding to Trump by going their own way, by getting out of NATO, by doing some other kind of European-based security arrangement. People like Zizek talked about Trump as a reason to maybe go in a different direction. So I think this has produced, to some degree, in the Republicans, a desire to show the allied states that they need this more than the United States needs it. And part of the way that they're communicating that is by, I think, trying to show the allies what the world would be like if they weren't allied states. And this, I think, is there in the question of Greenland. If the European states aren't allied to the United States, well, would the United States tolerate a European Union that had abandoned it, continuing to hold territory in that level of proximity to the United States? Similarly with Canada, there's a question here about, is Canada permitted, given its relative power, its relative dependence on the United States, to take sides in internal American politics? Is that something that would be tolerated, or would there be exposure? This is something that, if you look at what Canadian scholars who do international relations have tended to debate over the years, their internal debate is often about how much do you even want to be noticed by the United States? From a Canadian point of view, Canada does best when it's neither seen nor heard. When Americans are not thinking about Canada, they're not talking about Canada, they have concerns in other parts of the world. And so if Canada is seen to be in some way a player or a factor, then this raises questions about, why is Canada permitted to play?
Mm-hmm.
because Canada is not strong enough economically or militarily to defend its right to play.
Mm-hmm.
It therefore has this right granted to it as a consequence of the American relationship with the UK, which developed out of the 20th century.
Right. So bringing that up, I mean, the in the last couple of years, there's been an attempt within the European Union, within Canada, and within the United States to drop a kind of international terms of content moderation online and in the media to control the discourse. And a lot of it had to do with, I mean, not all of it, but a lot of it had to do with trying to wreck the chances of Donald Trump. There was a lot of suppression of his voters and his advocates and the people who liked him and championed him. And so, and I even heard during the run up to the election from some of Trump's people in the media that the UK should be considered an enemy of the United States because it's trying to abolish the First Amendment. That was argued, right? So, in on that kind of basis, it doesn't surprise me that Trump would target Justin Trudeau and Starmer and others. So anyway,
yeah, and it's an argument that cuts both ways because many of the European states feel that Elon Musk in particular is trying to interfere in their politics, that he's been given a government job and is nonetheless writing op-eds and committing resources in internal European affairs to try to influence the outcomes of elections. This is something that I'm currently in Germany. This is something that has people very upset in Germany, very upset in the UK. And Elon Musk in particular is a figure polls extremely poorly right now in terms of net rating and approval in both the UK and Germany. There is this felt sense that the American tech companies are trying to use their control over the discourse to influence negatively European politics. So just as it used to be the case that Putin and Russia was framed as trying in some way to sponsor or assist the right, there is now an argument in Europe that the United States and Donald Trump and Elon Musk are trying to assist the far right internally within European politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this thought, I recently had a conversation with someone and I said, well, I think it's pretty clear that the Republicans are not fascists. And this person made the argument that nevertheless, they are helping fascists in some of these European countries that don't have the same history of democratic traditions and are therefore more fragile, places like Austria or Hungary or Poland, that the right in these places, which in their view is a more serious kind of right, that this right is drawing strength from what the Trump administration is doing. And therefore, on that basis, they're very frustrated and angry with Musk in particular, who they think is not behaving like a public official ought to behave. And thinks that because he's a billionaire, he's above the usual kinds of rules that public officials have to observe.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try to think about this not from the point of view of either of the major players, but from my own point of view, like as a socialist, right? So they're saying that Musk is like Putin, trying to unduly influence their elections in places like Austria by his control, not just his speech, but his control over a very large and influential platform, Twitter, the way he can manipulate what gets seen there and what doesn't.
And also by directly writing op-eds in major papers on behalf of the AfD and UKIP and Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, well, listen, if that's their complaint, if their complaint is that he's writing op-eds and getting published, I mean, I'm sorry, I have no
as a public
sympathy.
official of the United States government. It's one thing to do it as a private citizen, but when you're a public official, it has a different character and flavor.
Yeah, it has a different character and flavor, but but nonetheless, as a public official, and just exactly what kind of public official Elon Musk is not clear to me. But in any case, even public officials in the United States have the First Amendment, and they can express their political views and then face political consequences in the United States for their, expressed opinions. And by the way, in the United States, the same thing applies. Justin Trudeau is free to write an opinion piece and have it published in the New York Times, and we the federal government cannot call upon the New York Times to refuse to publish that piece, right?
But it can become a diplomatic incident.
Yeah,
and it can be something that's raised at the level of international politics. Of why are you, having this person doing this thing? And I think the allies do have a legitimate grievance that they are very much affected by things the United States does, but they don't have any kind of direct say in U.S. politics, which frustrates them. Now, part of this is the fact that they're independent states and they're not U.S. states, so they don't have senators, they don't have members of Congress. It leaves them often in this impotent position, feeling subject to events that they don't have an ability to control, which I think is understandably frustrating, particularly when you could see what's happening in Canada right now. These kinds of tariffs are really gonna rile the allies up.
Yeah, okay, but putting the tariffs aside for a moment, just on Elon Musk and his writing op-eds, right? I mean, if you can't, Elon Musk is incredibly unpopular in the United States and around the world at the moment, right? He just did a freaking, what everyone thinks is a Sieg Heil at the inauguration. If you can't run a campaign well enough to overcome his influence in your elections, you've got a problem that has nothing to do with Elon Musk. And that's my opinion on his op-eds particularly, okay? And also the way in which the EU was cooperating with the Department of Homeland Security and other intelligence communities within the United States to impose on U.S. Media, both newspapers and online digital media, rules and guidelines for what would be acceptable content. Strikes me as not just interference from a foreign state over another state, but interference from a foreign state over the rights that Americans are supposed to have. So I am much more sympathetic for even big-time capitalists in the United States who want to claim their free speech rights and write op-eds than I am to these EU regulators and bureaucrats who are trying to threaten market share in order to impose restrictions on what Americans can see and decide to read. So that's my...
I sympathize with that. There is this very big trend still in Europe to view all of this as a communication problem and to say that it's a question of how people get their news and how people communicate, and to just raise a fear of the internet, in large part because many European states have a much stronger history of making interventions in the culture and controlling it, in part by using state funding to curate, to varying degrees, their societies and the kinds of organizations that are able to exist, both religious and political. In terms of public funding for political parties, public funding for religious organizations, and for universities and for university grants. This is something I'm seeing all around currently. There's a lot of public money involved in deciding what kinds of research projects go ahead and what don't. And so for them, the internet is a kind of Pandora's box. They're not used to the kind of marketplace of ideas that affected, first religion in the United States, and then later on our politics and our entertainment culture.
Yeah. So, okay. So putting that issue aside, or trying to bracket it for a moment anyway, the question that I think socialists should be asking is, to what degree can we anticipate that this will create an economic crisis in the United States? Or are we going to go back to 2008? Is this going to be a time for the socialist left to reorganize Occupy in a year and a half? No. Yeah.
The worst case for the United States is that Donald Trump expands the trade war to so many different fronts that it does produce an inflationary effect. You get shortages of goods and then inflation. Socialism doesn't tend to do well in a high inflation environment. Mm-hmm. Socialism does better in a high growth environment where there are social disruptions and dislocations that are a consequence of the growth. Mm-hmm. So looking for things to go badly in the United States is not, I think, the strategy that anybody should be looking to pursue. Mm-hmm. I think that this is really just likely to be a very sad situation where many people in Canada pay a very high price for misgovernment by Trudeau. You know, Trudeau just having really botched the relationship with Trump, really having, for too many years ignored American demands to raise NATO spending. For too many years, just having treated Trump badly, both in public and in private. And now ordinary Canadians are going to pay a god-awful price for it. And because of the election timetable, it won't get resolved, I think, quickly enough to limit the damage as much as it could be limited. Right now, if Trudeau would just go and say, look, we didn't realize that you were so upset. We really didn't realize it had gone so far. And we really don't want any of this. This is really not something that we can handle. We know we can't take it. We don't want this. What do we have to do? And he if Trump either gives Trudeau an easy way out of it, or, he makes it very clear that he wants things from Canada that Canada can't possibly give him. I think that would be a sensible way forward, especially because since Trudeau's going to be gone in a month anyway, any embarrassment that he creates by falling all over himself would be washed out by the next leader, who could take a much tougher kind of stance on it if need be, if it turns out to be something that can't be resolved. But if I were Trudeau, I would immediately try to negotiate.
Yeah, me too.
I would try very hard right away. But I don't think they're going to do that. Everything they're saying is that they want to immediately try to levy tariffs of their own, which is just going to further depress their economy. And then on top of that, it might provoke further escalation by Trump. If you really want Trump to back off the trade war, what you'd want him to do is to overextend it. And the way that you would get him to overextend it is to make it look like a viable strategy for extracting concessions. So you'd fall all over yourself to offer concessions in the hopes that he'll go, wow, this really works. I should do more of this really fast, really soon, huh? And get him to try a set of tariffs on the European Union prematurely. Get him to try tariffs on further states and to widen it. But if you instead go, we're going to fight you tooth and nail before we give you anything, not only is this going to prolong and intensify the pain for the ordinary Canadians, but it's also, on top of that, going to cause Trump to take a special interest in Canada and to focus on making sure he beats Canada. And that makes it even more likely that the eventual terms will be punitive. Canada needs to get the United States to stop looking at it.
Right. I mean, look,
the way for Canada to do okay.
People tend to underestimate Trump, and say things like, Trump, basically they just think he's stupid and anything he says is just vapid and based on nothing. And that's wrong. But also with Trudeau, I think we should think the same way. Like, we should grant Trudeau the fact that he's the prime minister, that he has a group of people around him that are give him the very best information they have, and that he is taking into account not only the interests of the Canadian state and people, supposedly, but also his own party and his own political career, right? So I think he's probably, from what you've said, he's trying to balance what the reality is for Canada from these tariffs against what would be the best outcome for his party, and then even possibly down the line his own career. He's not that old of a man. He could have influence in politics if he's not completely defeated as it goes. He could revive himself. So I think he's making the calculation that Trump may overextend himself, or with all these tariffs, so that there's a possibility that Trump's popularity might decline as the price of eggs don't go down, as these small effects from the tariffs are felt. And I think that's the bet he's making. What do you
Yeah, I think it's an unwise bet. I think
think?
that the Canada is in a particularly bad spot to do this. There are other states that would have an easier time playing this kind of game, but Canada
Mhm.
is much too reliant to get away with this for any length of time. And I do think that it's quite difficult to compete for leadership in Canadian political parties. They're structured in a way that makes it very difficult for someone to get back in quickly and easily after they've been taken out of the leadership position. It's going to be a long time, if ever, before Trudeau is able to contend again. And his poll position is so bad at this point. His personal favorability numbers are really, really bleak. I would think that he just doesn't have much to lose at this point by doing something that would be in the interests of bringing this to an end quickly. But one thing that I do think could happen is that they could, because of the election, start trying to frame the Conservatives as a fifth column for the Americans to try to boost their poll numbers relative to the Conservatives. And if they do that, that would be really counterproductive in terms of the Canadian interest. Because if they take that kind of road, then that will just encourage Trump to think that the Conservatives will give him a better deal when they win the election. And even if they're able to reduce their losses with that strategy, I don't think the Liberals are going to win the election given their polling position. I think the most they can do is reduce the scale of the defeat at this point.
Right. Speaking just again as a leftist and socialist, I'm noticing that quite a lot of the remnants of the social democratic Bernie Sanders millennial left is sort of rallying around Canada and Canada's decision right now. It seems to me. I mean, I'm not taking scientific polls or anything, but it's not surprising to me that that would happen if that were the case, given that Canada, turning the United States into Canada, has really been one of the aims of the social democratic left, at least in their imagination. And so it's just a natural thing for the Jacobin crew, say, or the DSA crew, to line up to behind Trudeau in this moment.
Yeah, one of the things, large parts of the millennial and Zoomer and Gen X, I mean, every generation of the left does this, is to act like smaller, weaker peripheral states are able to go head to head with the United States and to encourage them to do things that will cause great hurt and damage to a lot of people out of an unwillingness to be realistic and to really wrestle with, what are the actual facts here, which is that exports from Canada to the United States are a quarter of the Canadian economy. And then the import volume is almost another quarter. It's an incredible portion. Almost the whole Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the border. It's all truck traffic, guys. It's all truck traffic. They're not going to be able to handle this. And so the kind of, whatever sympathy you might have with the way that the Canadian system works, it does not mean that Canada has the kind of scale to win this kind of fight. And if you actually like the Canadian system and you think that elements of it are good, then you should try to protect it by arguing that we must end this. We must find a way to end this trade conflict with them as quickly as possible so that the minimum amount of damage is done. Because if the Canadian economy tanks, then the tax revenue for the Canadian state will tank and those social programs will get cut anyway.
Yeah. On the short story of the week, let's talk about that. It was Shirley Jackson and her short story, The Lottery. You've read that before, I assume?
Yeah, that was assigned way back when I was in school. It was fun to revisit it.
Yeah, I think I read that in high school for the first time. But it was fun to revisit it. I kind of looked into Shirley Jackson's career and was delighted, really, to discover that she attended the New School of Social Research in New York in the 40s, I believe. Why? Because at one point in my life, I applied to the New School MFA program and was accepted. I didn't end up attending, but it made me feel closer to Shirley Jackson. Sorry, I was trying to mute that. In any case, yeah, The Lottery. Seems like a Cold War short story about social conformity, and it was written around the same time that Adorno was creating his F scale on. It came up around the same time, before uh, sci-fi movies like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the scene. Um, I think it's much more powerful, of course, than the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and will be more long lasting. But what did you make of the story reading it today?
Yeah, there are bits of it that reminded me of the one we did a few weeks back. This, very, very civilized, but ultimately very cruel act.
Mm-hmm.
With the hanging, where they were very thorough about doing it all by the
Right.
book and in this very
Right.
civilized way.
Mm-hmm.
And in reading it, that's what struck me about it, is that they were doing this thing in a very civilized way. And I don't think that this would have been remarkable at the point at which it was published, but it is remarkable to me today how sociable and civil, even clearly very bad, cruel, vicious characters are in stories from 75, 100 years ago.
Mm. Well, I think the point of it is that your sociability, your civility, your politeness isn't much of a protection from the prospect of you doing incredibly immoral and backwards and violent things, especially after World War II and the rise of fascism and the Nazis. The aesthetic of politeness and civilization and uh, you know uh, being clean cut and well kempt and a proper member of society did not indicate any kind of actual civilized character.
Yes,
At
and
that
yet,
point.
in some ways, it would be an advance even to have that.
Yeah.
Given the kind of cruelty we get now, and how
Mm.
completely uncivilized it is. But then also on top of that, I was struck by the appeal to fairness that she makes at the end. And of course, within the horizons of that society, they have been entirely fair. Everybody drew lots,
Yeah.
and then she had the same chance as anybody else. And in
Mhm.
one sense, they were entirely fair. And so often we can get stuck in concepts, normative and political concepts, that lock us into ways of thinking about what we can do that are very limiting. It's not just that they were traditionalists who weren't thinking about what they were doing. It was that they had concepts for thinking about what they were doing, concepts like fairness, civilized
Mhm.
concepts that people had put time into and had thought about.
Mhm.
And nevertheless, despite this, the ways in which they were understanding those concepts just did not permit much straying outside of the box.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about the story that I'd forgotten was the fact that during the lead up to the conclusion, during the drawing of the lots, there was a discussion in the crowd about how some towns are no longer holding a lottery. There was a discussion that indicated that there might be a progressive trend taking hold in the rest of the society, and it kind of gave you it gave the whole thing even a more tragic character, because there was an option there. There was a live option within their community to end this system, but it was not taken up in time for I think the main character was named Tessie, to maintain, keep to stay alive. At the time, also, it's worth noting that readers of the New Yorker really reacted strongly against the story. They felt it was uncouth, uncivilized, too violent, a violation of norms, that it shouldn't have been published. They reacted very strongly to it at the time, apparently.
Yeah, in part because to actually change something like that before one more person is subject to it, when you haven't yet brought about the conditions under which people will arrive at that in a discussion, you would have to do something quite dramatic and radical.
Right.
So there is a kind of radical implication in it that if you want this to stop now, you're not going to get there by having this very civilized discussion. That
Right.
very civilized discussion won't stop it now. It might stop it later, but not quite yet.
If you were going to make a sequel to the story, you might take the husband of Tessie and her children into the next year and have the husband or one of the kids try to start a campaign to end the lottery, and see where it goes from there. And you lots of choices to make about that. But that's conceivable. But but I don't think it would be nearly as powerful a story as what we're actually offered.
It could be really commercially successful, though, especially if you called it something like the Lotto games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, the lottery and the Hunger Games have a lot in common. That didn't come to mind for me as I was reading this, because while I've seen the Hunger Games, it didn't make the impression on me that it did for my kids, say, I think.
Of course not, because you're much too old.
I know. I know.
That's
I was
why they
saying
assign
that
the
in
lottery when you're in high school.
I was saying that. I was recognizing that fact in a kind of civilized, polite way. But yeah, you're right. I'm much too old for the. But I remember Philip Seymour Hoffman was in one of them, wasn't he? He was in one of those movies. Was it the first one, second one? I don't know. They're like 100 of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and who's the one who plays the snowman? Sutherland, Donald Sutherland.
Donald Sutherland, who recently.
Speaking of
died,
They Live, and
yeah, oh yeah, Donald Sutherland wasn't in They Live. He was in the 70s version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh, that's right. Sometimes I mix those two up.
Yeah, no, yeah, and actually, of the versions of the Invasion of the Body Snatchers that exists, I've only seen the two. The first one and the one in the 70s. I prefer the Donald Sutherland version, the New Left retake, the kind of pro-commie version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But yeah, so anyway, I think people should read the Shirley Jackson again. It's worthwhile. I do think that the main thing that to take away from it today is to remind yourself that there can be pressures to conform and that are self-destructive and violent and backward amongst groups of people you might like, that you might agree with, amongst your own tribe, and you should be aware of that. Whether you're a MAGA Republican or a Democrat or some sort of socialist, just take note of that tendency and don't end up with a rock in your hand in the future. So, but what do you think is going to happen in the next couple of weeks with these? Oh, you know what I didn't talk about, and I want to say before we wrap this up. Look, the opportunity for the left right now, I think, is an opportunity. Tragically, and it's an awful opportunity, but is the fact that there's so many deportations going on in a way that I think is an abuse of people's rights. That this aim to take immigrants and lock them up in Gitmo, or even just to deport foreign nationals over the content of their political speech. These things should absolutely be opposed by the left on the principle of you could do it just as a straightforward, like, we're Americans, damn it. That's not how things go here. You can't lock people up without due process. You can't deport people for the content of their speech. And I think that's the kind of argument that people who supported Donald Trump, like some portion of them, would hear and maybe eventually start to take up before they get the rocks in their hands themselves, maybe. What do you think?
Well, I think that immigration tends to become the dominant frame when nobody's offering any other structural explanation for what's going on. Mm-hmm. And if people are caught up in trying to decide who to blame and who to be mad at, and they're not thinking about how is this actually happening? Why are people getting so upset that they're doing and saying the things that they're doing? Then that's when people adopt frames that very, very heavily emphasize immigration. And I think that it's a sign that we've not been talking about the right things, that people have reached a point where they think that this very, very hardline immigration policy is the way to improve their standard of living and their possibilities for themselves and their children.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to get back to actually giving a real account of why the world is becoming the way that it's becoming and what can be done to make it better. And if we don't give that real account and we just yell and scream and say Orange Man bad, that is not going to get us anywhere. And it doesn't differentiate us from the Democrats.
Right. And we need to differentiate ourselves from the Democrats. It's desperately need to do that. Did you see the any footage from their DNC meeting where they put David Hogg in as I guess second in command of the DNC and went through a whole rigmarole about making sure that the right number of non-binary people were on the slate to vote for him?
Oh, they're still sticking with this stuff. They're not backing off.
No.
They're waiting for a whiplash, a reaction that goes back the other way. Nobody's trying to get a real governing majority to actually do anything anymore. They're just trying to squeeze out little wins, 53 senators, tiny little majorities in the House. And then, do most of it with executive action, see what the court lets you do, putter around. It's getting sad. We hardly have any functioning government anymore because there isn't even an aspiration to try to put together any kind of larger movement that cuts across anything.
Yep. Well, there is an aspiration for that, but it's a tiny one. We're going to talk about it in the Parrot Room again, the campaign for a Socialist Party and what Sublation's doing with that. I met up with a few people yesterday at a little cafe here in Portland to talk about starting up the Sublation project of these research projects on the working class in Portland. And we can talk about that in the Parrot Room in just a bit. It'll be starting around 10:20. And but thanks, Benjamin. I'm always glad to talk to you because you're really well informed, and I can kick back a bit when it's on a topic that I know you've already written about. So I appreciate it. Yes, join us over at the Patreon. There's going to be a Zoom call conversation with all the patrons, and we'll see you next week.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around